Part 3. You got quiet. Is everything okay? I chuckled. Yeah, Alyssa is here with her new friend. Taryn, I stated. Ah, and they're right there. Track took Taryn to see Dad's cars. Alyssa and I were staring at each other, I shrugged. What are you doing? Pulling into the gates, he stated with a smile in his voice. My head shot towards the door. Really? You're here? The excitement in my voice made him laugh. Yes, I am, although I can't quite tell if you're excited about that or not. I turned and started to run towards the door, but the phone was still plugged in. Luckily, I didn't break it this time. I'll meet you in the garage, I said quickly, then hung up and ran towards the door. Oh, Jonathan's here, Alyssa exclaimed, and I stopped at the door and turned. I had forgotten about her. He'll get to meet Taryn after all. Her song-like voice grated in my head sometimes. I frowned as she followed me as I rushed down the stairs and through the hallway. When I got to the garage, he was stepping out of his car, smiling at me. For some reason, he looked even more gorgeous than normal. Alyssa was on my heels, but I didn't care. I hurried around his car and flung my arms around his neck. He laughed and lifted me up by the waist. If I knew this would happen when I left for one day, I would have done it a lot sooner. I rolled my eyes and then kissed him. He finally stood me back on the ground, but kept his arms around me. It seems I don't have to ask if you miss me, he whispered. I missed you. Jonathan, I'm so glad you're here, came Alyssa's voice, and my smile faded. We both turned, although he kept his arms around me. She walked over, completely ignoring the fact that we were still in each other's arms. Taryn is here, the one I told you about. He nodded, and she looked around, biting her lower lip. Track took him to see my uncle's cars, but I don't see them. I wanted you to meet him. I chuckled, and Jonathan smiled. Raina's father doesn't keep those cars in the garage. They're very expensive, very rare cars. They're kept in a special room underground. Oh, she shrugged. Well, why don't we go and find them? Then you can meet him. Jonathan looked down at me. I'll meet him soon enough, Alyssa. Right now, I'd like to finish saying hello to Raina. I looked up at him, my eyes sparkling with happiness. She nodded and looked around again. Oh, well, yes, all right. I'll just go and find them then. She turned and waved over one of the men and asked him where the car collection was. Then she followed him out. Alone at last, I whispered. Jonathan glanced up at Michael and Martin, and I shrugged. Well, nearly. He brushed my hair back from my face and kissed me softly again. Then he took my hand and walked us towards the door. A worker took his keys and went to park it for him. He said hello to Michael and Martin as we walked in, and then we headed down the hall. Let's go hide somewhere where she can't find us, I whispered, and he chuckled. But my father stepped out of a room just then, and we stopped. Hello, you two, he said, smiling at me. Then he looked at Jonathan. I was going to call you, but since you're here... Dad, I moaned, and my father chuckled. In order to keep the peace, how about I call you later? My dad winked, and I smiled. Ah, young love, he laughed. Jonathan squeezed my hand. I could come find you as soon as Raina is settled for the day. My dad shook his head. It can wait. I looked up. You're staying all night? When he nodded, I grinned again and nearly bounced on my toes. Another chuckle from my dad, and I pulled Jonathan down the hall. You didn't break your phone again, did you? He whispered as we walked. What? No. Almost, but no, I chuckled. Seems I might need to get you a supply of them, just in case. I shook my head, still smiling. Any more unknown numbers? He asked carefully. Oh yeah, that. I told him what Track had found, and then what he had done. He didn't smile. We headed towards my room. Who do you think it is? I asked as we walked over and picked it up. I don't know, but I'm going to have some guys look into it. He pushed some buttons and then put it to his ear. I leaned in, trying to listen. I heard nothing. He frowned, pushed a few more buttons, and then sat it down. I want to change your phone number. When he paused, I realized he was asking my permission. I shrugged. Okay. I didn't care. I didn't use it much other than talking to him, and he would know the number. He pulled his phone out, pushed a button, and then put it to his ear. He pulled me into his arm with his free hand. Stacy, I need you to get another phone on my account. It's for Raina, but I want a new number. Make sure it's unlisted and have it overnighted to the manor. He looked down at me. That's a good question. How about pink? He laughed when I made a sour face. No? Raina doesn't like pink. How about blue? She looks beautiful on blue. I knitted my brows. Who was he talking to like that? He finished the call and then put the phone back in his pocket. Who was that? I asked. He looked around the room. That was Stacy Mills. She's one of my admin assistants. When I shrugged, he winked. It's not PC to call them secretaries anymore. Oh, I smiled and he nodded. Besides, she does a lot more than secretarial work. Really? Like what? I said, hearing my voice go up an octave. He shook his head. Why, Raina Blvd, are you jealous? I balked. No, She keeps one of my offices running. She holds down all my schedules, sets up all my meetings, including travel. She even makes sure I don't miss my family's birthday. I frowned and he winked. And she knows all about you. She has orders to interrupt me now, no matter what I'm doing, if you call. She's actually very excited to meet the boss's girl. I chuckled a little, still feeling a bit uneasy. Her husband is one of my accountants. They have a young daughter, Chelsea. We'll have to invite them over when we get our own place. Okay, now I felt better. He hugged me to him. I think I'm going to leave right now and come back so I can get more of this, he grinned. I playfully pushed him away and he walked over to my laptop. I emailed you 3 more places to look at. He lifted the top and started pushing buttons. He was fast. I still was a hunt and peck kind of person. One is a loft in a very nice part of the city. The view is amazing and the floor plan will give us a lot to work with. A few more rapid buttons. The other is a house, a little farther out, but it has some acreage. He winked at me. Since you seem to like it outside. I grinned and stepped up to him. The last one is an old building. It was a firehouse at one time. It would need a complete overhaul, but the location's amazing. There's not a lot of grounds there, but there's a nice yard and a small garden. I moved under his arm, and he tapped out the keys with one hand, his other now over my shoulder. He opened my email box, and I frowned. 84 emails. I leaned forward, and then heard Alyssa behind me. There you two are. I sighed and turned, but Jonathan went back to the keyboard, typing fast and slamming a few keys. I glanced over at him. His jaw was tight. Track and Taryn were with her this time, and Track sighed. She found us. Alyssa chuckled as if that were a joke, and then took Taryn's hand. When they got to us, I nudged Jonathan. He looked over his shoulder and then lowered my screen a bit and turned. Alyssa introduced them, and they shook hands. I've seen you at the meetings when I come to your offices, Taryn stated, his voice full of admiration. Jonathan had offices, as in plural? Well, now that we have something in common, Jonathan smiled, you'll have to stop by when I'm there and say hello. Then he looked down at me. Although I don't spend much time there these days. I grinned and Alyssa nodded. Oh yes, maybe one day Taryn and I could come to your office downtown and we could go for a drink. Then she looked at me. Oh, but Raina isn't allowed to go out at the manor. I looked down and Jonathan stiffened. Raina's father is a very powerful man, Alyssa. You know that. Raina has made the sacrifice for him by having to be a bit careful with where she goes. Her life is precious to us, and she does what we ask so that we know she's safe. The room fell silent. Alyssa looked kicked, and I wonder what I thought of what he said. It sounded romantic and chivalrous, but it also sounded like I was a bird in a cage, like I saw in the movies, sitting pretty on my perch, being brought fine-grained to sing and swing while others admired me on a golden stand. Track cleared his throat. Well, on that note, I'm hungry. I'm going to go down to the kitchen. He looked at me and I shook my head. I'll be right back, he stated. Why don't you meet us in the game room, Jonathan said, smiling then. Track gave a nod, not smiling, and left. Okay, this was a bit awkward. Jonathan looked back at the computer. Raina, why don't you show our guest to the game room? I'll finish this up and be right behind you. He smiled at me, and I wondered if he realized what he had said. I half expected to hear Alyssa chuckle and comment on the fact that she was family, or that Jonathan didn't live here, but she stayed quiet. I gave a soft nod and smiled at Taryn. Do you play air hockey? I've played it a few times. Well then, I promise to go easy on you. Jonathan smiled at me, kissed my cheek, and turned back to the computer. What was on there that had him in such an odd mood all of a sudden? As we walked, Alyssa's mood lifted, and she chatted away about things that didn't really matter. As I took the first step down the stairs, I cried out and grabbed my thigh and lost my balance. Michael had me by the waist and pulled me back up. The tingle wasn't a tingle this time. It shot out hard and hot. I turned into Michael's chest and steadied my breathing. I heard Martin walk up and tell Alyssa and Taryn to follow him, but I didn't care. The pain was searing down my leg. I grabbed onto Michael with one hand, the other still holding my thigh. I am in control, not you, I hissed at the air. My eyes were closed tightly as I fought to push it back. My hands shook and I felt the sweat drip down my face. I was the one in control, I told myself, letting the anger give me power. I would not let this control me. I would shift when I wanted and only when I wanted. I gasped as it moved further up my leg. No, I growled, clenching my teeth. I felt Michael's hand still on my waist. Almost, I groaned, pushing it harder and deeper back to wherever it went when I wasn't shifting. I didn't step out of the pain. I let it make me mad so I could push harder. Finally, my whole body shook and I fell against my bodyguard, gasping for breath. He held me against him like a rock wall of protection. Raina! I heard Jonathan's cry from behind me and I didn't move. My body still shook and I was trying to make sure I had succeeded. Michael's chest rumbled as he told him what I couldn't manage to just yet. Jonathan went to take me, but I put one hand up, my arm shaking visibly. I just need a minute, I whispered. I'm fine. No, you're not. You need to lay down, he whispered, his voice full of worry. Then I heard Track and moaned. Great, now I had them all worried. She is suppressing her shifts, Track explained to him. She wants to get control over them. Well, that was good. At least I didn't have to explain that one. Is it usually this hard to do? Jonathan asked. In the beginning, came Track's voice. That also made me feel better. I thought it was just another me quirk. Will this hurt her, stopping it? I listened then, realizing I hadn't thought of that. It'll make her next shift more severe. Great. What exactly did more severe mean? Then she should let it happen, Jonathan replied, his own voice a little shaky. I pushed off of Michael, patting his mammoth chest. No, I'm fine. My strength was coming back now. I drew in a long, slow breath and turned to Jonathan. I'm fine. His face was so drawn and his gray eyes were tight with worry. I gave a small smile. I have to learn to do this. I turned to Track, who shrugged. Well, you need to learn, otherwise you won't be able to control it, and your shifts will keep coming whenever they want. I nodded and looked back to Jonathan. See? This is all normal. Well, it's not exactly normal, Ray, Track chuckled. It's usually a full wolf doing this. You need more training. I shrugged. Okay then, train me. He smiled. It's not that easy. I know what it's like for me, a full wolf. I have helped you, and you are learning. To do more, well, I'd need to talk to Phil. He clamped his mouth shut quickly, and I frowned. Phil. I never did call him. He was laying in bed, hurt because of me, and I forgot to even call him. What kind of pack wolf was I? I lowered my head and Jonathan stepped up. Then we'll get you some more training. I want to make sure you do this safely. Phil is still healing, Track replied quietly. Still? I asked. How bad is he, Track? He should be better by now. It's been 3 days. The panic crept through me. What had I done that night? Slow it down, Ray, he chuckled, putting both hands up. He'll be fine. He just can't help you with your shifting right now. I looked up at Jonathan. I never did call him. He's hurt because of me, and with the party, and then I never even called. My face was so full of self-loathing, and Jonathan stroked my cheek. I'm sure Phil will be fine, Raina. I'm also sure that he understands. I shook my head slowly. No, he won't. Even if he does, what kind of wolf am I? He's my alpha, my friend. He was hurt saving me, and I didn't even call. My eyes widened, and I looked at Track. I should go see him. I whipped my head back around to Jonathan. Could you take me to go see him? Track stepped up. Raina, you can't go see him right now. I frowned, looking back. Why not? Suddenly, it felt as if they were hiding something from me. Because he's healing, and the last thing he needs is you bugging him, he chuckled. I wasn't buying that, and my eyes tightened. He's hurt worse than you want me to know, isn't he? Track sighed. You're getting to be as much of a drama queen as your cousin. Relax and quit making everything seem so dramatic. I'll tell him you feel like crap for not calling and blah blah, and when we can have visitors, I'll let you know. I sighed. Fine, but you better tell him. Can I call him? Track shrugged. Help yourself, you know the number. I looked back towards my room and took a step. Jonathan smiled. Remember, we have guests, love. Track looked at him hard, but Jonathan kept smiling at me. I'll make it quick, I stated, and trotted down to my room. When I called Phil's cell phone, Rock answered again. He told me that Phil was in the shower and that he would tell him I called. I had to let that be enough for now. I sat the phone back down on the nightstand to let it charge, then went with the guys to the game room. Chapter 4. Taryn was actually pretty good at air hockey. When we first arrived, he asked how my ankle was, realizing that was what Martin must have told him. I explained that it was fine now. Jonathan was actually a great host and engaged Taryn in talk and entertainment. Alyssa and I stood and watched all three guys on the motorcycle game. Track won the first round. They had just started the second game when I saw a movement out of the corner of my eye and I turned. Ryan was walking down the hallway. He turned and gave me a wave and a smile but kept going. I trotted out into the hallway calling his name. He stopped and I walked up to him. "What's wrong with Phil?" I blurted. "Track says he'll be fine, but I can't go see him. When I call, Rock answers and says he's busy." Ryan sighed and I shook my head. "What is it, and why won't anyone tell me?" He put a massive hand on my shoulder and smiled. "Phil is still healing, Raina. The injuries are not that severe. They will heal just fine." "Then why can't I see him?" He looked around the hall, then back at me. "Phil disobeyed some orders that night. Until that situation is sorted out, he can't have visitors." My eyes widened and I shook my head. "Phil would never!" I blinked hard. I don't believe it," I whispered. It was very hard for a pack wolf to flat out disobey an alpha. I know Track had skirted the rules now and then, but to flat out disobey? I didn't know it was even possible. But even if it was, Phil would never do that unless... My hand moved to my mouth. Did he do it when he was saving me? I could barely get the words out. Ryan gave a slow nod, watching my reaction closely. My eyes watered. "Then it's my fault." I shook my head in disbelief. "Ryan, you can't punish him for what he did to save me." There was no anger in my voice. My mind was still trying to grasp what I heard. "You were not in control, Raina. You're still a pup in many ways. He's a click alpha. He knew better." "What did he do that's so bad?" I snapped, just a little. "He got me back here safely. Doesn't that count for anything?" I didn't realize a tear was running down my cheek until he reached out and wiped it away. He drew in a slow breath. "It's a complicated situation. I need you to trust me here. Phil is a good wolf and a great clique leader. What happened is being sorted out. Sometimes that just takes time." "But why can't I see him?" I whined, the guilt yoking me heavily. "Because there are things that still need to be sorted out." I shook my head. "I don't understand, Ryan. If the others can see him..." Ryan shook his head this time. "Enough, Raina," he said in a soft but tight voice. "When he can have visitors, we will let you know." I went to argue, to ask for more answers, to beg if needed, but then I got the look. My head instantly dropped and my shoulders fell forward. Ryan kissed the top of my head. "You have alphas for a reason. This is one of them. Trust me." I could only nod. I heard footsteps and turned to see Track walking over slowly. He looked to Ryan, who nodded. He stepped up and saw my face. Ryan calmly told him what he had told me. "Take care of her. I have a meeting with her father," he stated, then turned and walked away. Track put his arm against mine, and I sighed. "All of this because of me." "It's not your fault." "Everyone keeps saying that," I snapped, wiping my cheek roughly. "I'm getting tired of everyone saying it's not my fault. It is my fault." I went to turn. I was going to run. I needed to be alone for a while. I had only taken a few steps when I heard Jonathan call out to me. Crap! I had forgotten about him. I stood up straighter, drew in a long breath, and then turned. "What's wrong?" he asked, noticing my wet cheeks. I told him, and he looked at Track, who only shrugged. Then Jonathan rubbed my arm. "You have to trust that Ryan knows what he's doing," he whispered. I only nodded, glancing at the floor. Track stepped up. "Why don't I take her to her sitting room? while you handle the guest, he stated harshly. Jonathan looked back towards the game room. Why don't you do that? When Track and I both looked at him surprised, he turned his head the other way. I have to go talk to Thomas and Ryan. When he finally seemed to remember to look at us, he smiled at me. I'll be there in just a few minutes, and I'll give excuses. He gestured towards the game room door. Track took my hand and started to pull me down the hall, not waiting for Jonathan to change his mind. I looked back over my shoulder, very confused, and saw Jonathan head the way Ryan had. It was an hour before he came back. I was sitting on the couch, not really watching the movie Track had put in. He was sitting with me, a half-eaten sandwich on a plate next to him. Jonathan looked at the TV and smiled. This is one of your favorites, isn't it? When I shrugged, he sat down next to me and the room went silent again. The rest of the movie played, even though I don't think they watched it any more than I did. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more that Ryan and Track weren't telling me. If the rest of the pack could see Phil, why couldn't I? Somewhere near the end of the movie, I blinked hard. He's mad at me, I thought to myself. That was the only explanation that seemed to fit. Phil was angry at me for whatever had happened. It wasn't so much that I couldn't see him. He didn't want to see me. What had I done that night? The movie finally ended, and Jonathan turned to me. I told your father about the phone number. I nodded numbly. Who cared about a phone number? I had done something so awful that my clique alpha didn't even want to see me. Ryan and Track were being gentle and not telling me to spare my feelings. I gave him the number, and he's having the security team find out who's calling. Okay, I whispered. He reached over and took my hand. The new phone will arrive tomorrow. Only a few people will have that new number, for now. Again, I gave a vacant nod. I had to find out what I had done. I had to see Phil and apologize. A pack wolf had a deep desire to please her alpha, but he was also my friend. I blinked up at Jonathan then. He wouldn't take me. He loved me, but he was also a bit jealous of my pack ties. I glanced over at Track, my best friend. There was a small hope there that I could get him to help, unless Ryan had given Alpha orders. I had to assume he already had, since Track wasn't divulging any information. That left me to find a way on my own. Just then Alyssa and Taryn walked in, and I smiled. Bingo, I thought. When Track and Jonathan both looked at me, I realized I had thought it with the part of my mind they could hear. My mind raced. I know why he hasn't told her he's part wolf. I let my thought continue, and they seemed to relax. Taryn has to leave now and wanted to say goodbye, she said quietly, smiling at me. I noticed that she made sure not to look at Jonathan, and I wondered what excuse he had made earlier. We all stood as they approached. He shook our hands, and I smiled. It was nice to meet you, Taryn. You'll have to come back for another visit soon. Alyssa chuckled. I'm leaving tomorrow, Raina, so it'll have to be in the city. Tomorrow? I asked with a panic in my voice. Everyone looked at me in surprise. It's about time, I let myself think, and Track smiled. When they left, Track blew out his breath. That is one person I'm glad to see leave, he whispered, and Jonathan nodded. I walked over and looked through my movies. Another one? Track moaned. Yep, I just want to relax and watch movies, I stated, bending over and shuffling through them. Truth was, I needed time to plan, and I didn't have much time. This was the best way. Neither of them would be trying to talk to me during the movie, leaving me free to think. Well, I'll let you two have at it, Track stated. I'm gonna go eat and see if Ryan's still around. He left without waiting for an answer. Jonathan turned the lights off as I popped the movie in. When I snuggled up next to him, he smiled. So, was this your plan? The word plan made me jump a little. I was no good at hiding things. I've never have been. He squeezed me and then leaned down and kissed me. Okay, so planning had to wait just a little while. It ended up having to wait through the whole movie. We laid down on the couch and talked between kisses. I was smiling and giggling, and he was telling me stories from when he was younger. I told him a few of my own, and he laughed in all the right places. I reached up and put my hand against his cheek. You are amazing, I whispered. Really? How so? He smiled. You could have your pick of any female. I'm sure of that now more than ever. And yet you chose to be with me. You're either mad or an angel for dealing with all my issues. Can I choose an angel? Being mad isn't nearly so sexy sounding. We both laughed and the kissing started again. Finally I had to cover a yawn. He frowned. Time for bed. What? No, I exclaimed. Not yet. A while later I yawned again and he sat partially upright looking down at me. Raina, you need to sleep. I'm 3/4 vampire, I reminded him. I don't really need to sleep every night. He leaned down and kissed the tip of my nose. Maybe not every night, but tonight you do. I frowned and he rubbed his nose against mine. Although I'm glad you're willing to become sleep deprived for me. Then he sat all the way up. I was pouting a bit, but yawned again. I couldn't get tired. I had plans, and I had to do this tonight. I stole a glance at his watch. It was only 2 a.m. That left plenty of time before sunrise. We stood up, kissed some more, and then he walked me to my room. I shook my head. I want to see you out, I stated, threading my arm through his. He frowned a little, but then nodded. As his car pulled away, my mind raced. Guilt swam through here too, but I pushed it away. I was on a mission. I walked back into the manor, looked around, and then headed down a hall. I quickly recalled my talk with Ryan and nodded. He had never said that I was not allowed to see Phil, so I wouldn't be breaking any direct orders. I jogged up the stairs and headed towards the guest wing. Then I saw her and smiled. Alyssa was coming this way. How perfect. She looked behind her to see if I was smiling at someone else. I reached out, grabbed her arm, and pulled her the other way. We need to talk. You can't be serious, she gasped as we stood in my bathroom, the one place my bodyguards and Track wouldn't easily follow me to. I nodded. I'm dead serious, and you will help me. She raised her brows and crossed her arms in front of her. And why exactly would I do that? She said in a sour voice. Because you have put me through hell these last few weeks, and you owe me, I said, even trying to give that sneer that she saved for me or Track when others weren't around. She tossed her head and laughed. I thought she might have that reaction. I squared my shoulders and pulled out the big guns. Because if you don't, I'll tell my dad how good it feels having another female around, and he'll talk to your dad, and they'll make you stay longer. I huffed triumphantly and lifted my chin. Her brows rose. What? Wasn't that a horrible threat? My mind raced as she stood there looking at me. And I scrambled. And I'll tell my dad I don't like Taryn, and he won't allow him to visit you while you're here. Ugh, was I really this desperate? That was horrible, and it left a sour feeling in my stomach. Her eyes narrowed then. Would you really do that? She asked in a low voice. I inhaled slowly. She was mad, but she was also worried. I went to confirm my threat, and then I sighed. No, I wouldn't. I lowered my head. I wasn't any good at being mean or manipulative, but at least the sour feeling in my stomach vanished. Fine, I'll do it, she snapped, and I looked up with confusion painted on my face. She shrugged. It might be fun. I smiled, and she pursed her lips. Plus, seeing the trouble you get in will be greatly entertaining. I growled softly, and she held up her hands. Don't worry, I won't tell your secret. I just know you'll get caught. You're too honest not to. She laughed then, and I sighed. Great. This evil cousin was my only ally. How ironic was that? And that's where I'm going to stop.